time. Is that okay? All right, we're going through I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, which is a book that we wrote to try and show you why Christianity is true. And we argue from the ground up that it's true. We start with truth, and we ultimately wind up at the point that the Bible is the true Word of God. And so far, we've covered point 1, and we are in the middle of point 2 right now. Does God exist? We pointed out that truth exists. You can know it. It's absolute. And for the past few weeks, we've been talking about the arguments for God. We talked about the argument from the beginning of the universe, known as the cosmological argument. The universe exploded into being out of nothing, which means something outside the universe brought it into existence. And then we talked about the fact that the universe is incredibly designed. And if it's designed, it must have had a designer. And we also pointed out that life is also incredibly designed. And then we talked about this concept of a moral law. Every law has a lawgiver. There is an absolute moral law. Therefore, there's an absolute moral lawgiver. We pointed out that there is a moral prescription prescribed on humanity, that there are certain things that are really right, and that's how we ought to live. And then, conversely, there are certain things that are really wrong, and that's how we ought not live. If there is a real moral law prescription, there must be a moral law prescriber. And one of the reasons we gave last week was we know the difference between Mother Teresa and Hitler, don't we? We know that Mother Teresa was better than Hitler. And we say, how do we know that? Well, in the same way we know that Map A of Scotland is a better map of Scotland than is Map B. You say, how do we know that? Because we can see a real unchanging place called Scotland. And when we compare Map A to Scotland and Map B to the real Scotland, we can see that Map A, while it's not perfect, is a better representation of the true Scotland than is Map B. That's exactly what we do when we compare Mother Teresa and Hitler. Mother Teresa wasn't the standard, neither was Hitler. There's a standard beyond both of them by which we measure both of them. And we say Mother Teresa, why she wasn't perfect, lived up to that standard better than did Hitler. We also pointed out that you know right from wrong best by your reactions, not your actions, right? We even brought it up last week about this incredibly barbaric procedure known as partial birth abortion. And there are some people in our government who actually think this is a right. That's where they deliver the baby nearly completely out of the womb. They drill a hole in the back of the baby's skull and suck her brains out. And as I mentioned to you last time at the Harvest Conference, when I said, how could we convince somebody that that is not right, somebody in the back of the room said, drill a hole in the back of their head. That's exactly right. See, that person would know by his reaction that that's wrong. Because as soon as you try and drill a hole in somebody's head, they go, hey, this is wrong. Okay? Now, we pointed out that when we were talking about the moral argument, we are not saying that atheists can't be moral. They can. Many of them are. We are not saying that atheists don't know morality. They do. Why? Because it's written on their hearts just like our hearts. But we are saying that atheists can't justify morality. There's no way to say something is right or wrong objectively unless there's a standard of right and wrong beyond humanity. But of course, atheists believe that if there is no God, then we're just a concoction of chemicals on the periodic table, right? We're nothing but glorified dirt, essentially. Okay? In other words, atheists can theorize about how murder is wrong, but atheism provides no objective standard that establishes why murder is wrong, or anything else that's wrong, rape or theft or anything else. If we're just chemicals, you can't say that anything's wrong with anything. You can't justify it. That's all we're saying here. We intuitively know that there are certain things that are right and certain things that are wrong, so there must be a source of that, i.e. that's God's very nature. And we pointed out one of the books out there right now which is really hot. God is Not Great. How Religion Poisons Everything by Christopher Hitchens. I've been reading this book, and Hitchens is a great writer, but he's a terrible philosopher and a terrible theologian. In fact, he says religion poisons everything, but religion does not poison everything. Everything poisons religion. As we spoke about last time. He talks about all the evil Christians and religious people have done over the centuries, and you know what we say? You know, you're right. That doesn't mean it's false, though. That doesn't mean there is no God or Jesus didn't rise from the dead. It simply means that we're fallen creatures who often do wrong things. But you wouldn't know right and wrong unless there was a God. who defined it. We poison religion by our behavior. Religion, especially Christianity, of course, is pure and true, but we're the ones that poison it. So we agree with atheists. Some atheists live better moral lives than some Christians. And some who say they're church people have poisoned the teachings of Christ. Church history has often been immoral, unjust, and even overtly evil. We agree. But we are saying that there is no moral or immoral, no just or unjust, no good or evil unless there's a God. So these atheists who are arguing against God are actually using God in order to argue against Him. They're borrowing from the Christian worldview in order to argue against it. They're borrowing the standard of morality that could only come from God to say He's immoral or religion's immoral. Do you see how this is self-defeating? It's like trying to prove that you can't trust math by solving some equation. You can't use math to disprove math, to say you ought not use it. It's self-defeating. And we talked last time about moral dilemmas, like the life raft dilemma. And we pointed out that the only reason there's a dilemma is because you know there is an absolute moral value to life, that life is so valuable. You got to throw somebody off because you don't have enough food, or because everybody's going to die if you don't throw somebody off, right? That dilemma. The reason you struggle with the dilemma is because you know how valuable life is. If life wasn't valuable, if there was no value to life, you'd say, who cares? Throw everybody off. And we pointed out that there's a hierarchy, a moral hierarchy, from things to people to God. Unfortunately, in our country, sometimes we invert those. We are more upset over Michael Vick killing some dogs, which is terrible, of course, than we are over people who kill babies. We've got it exactly backwards. All right, let's sum this up and we'll move into the next section. From these three arguments, from the cosmological, teleological, and moral arguments, we can know something about the first cause. From the cosmological argument, we know that this being is self-existing, immaterial, and eternal outside the universe. We also know that He's infinitely powerful because He created out of nothing. Why must He be eternal? Because He created time. Why must He be powerful? Because He created out of nothing. Why must He be immaterial? Because He created out of nothing as well. He didn't create out of pre-existing material. This being must be immaterial, timeless, and powerful. From the design argument, we know He's infinitely intelligent because He put this entire universe together with such precision, as we talked about last time. We also know He has purpose because He put us here for a purpose, because this universe should not even be here unless there's a mind behind it. From the moral argument, we know He's absolutely morally perfect, and we also know He's personal. You don't have an obligation to an impersonal force. You only have obligations to persons. So, interestingly enough, these attributes are the same attributes of the God of biblical Christianity, and we have arrived at these attributes without opening the Bible. These three arguments, cosmological, teleological, moral, give us these attributes, all right? So as we said last time as well, let's go back to where we started a number of weeks ago. We gave arguments for theism, and through these three arguments, we show that theism is true beyond a reasonable doubt, right? So if that's the case, what does that do for atheism and pantheism? They can't be true. If our logic is good to this point, if our reasoning is good to this point, you got to throw away pantheism and atheism, which means that these world religions could be true. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because they're theistic, right? But these world religions cannot be true. Hinduism, Buddhism, New Age, secular humanism, Mormonism, polytheism, Wicca, Confucianism, Taoism. That's New Jersey for you, right? They can't be true. Why can't they be true? Because they're non-theistic. Now, I'm not saying that everything those world religions teach is false. I'm not saying that. I'm simply saying on the issue of God, they're wrong. Now, that's a pretty big issue, don't you think? If you got the God thing wrong, you're in trouble from there. In fact, Mortimer Adler, who was one of the great authors of the 20th century, he wrote encyclopedias. He was so bright. And in one of his encyclopedias, the God entry was so long, longer than any other entry, he was once asked the question, Why is it the longest entry in your encyclopedia? And he said, I suppose it's because more implications flow from the question of God than anything else. Think about it, it's true. If God exists, then there's hope and meaning and purpose to your life. If God doesn't exist, there's nothing but despair. And how you live and what you do has ultimately no meaning if God does not exist. This is the greatest question that we all need to answer. Does God exist? If He does, then life really matters. If He doesn't, ultimately it doesn't at all. All right, so which of these is true? If theism's true to this point, we've got three choices from major religious worldviews. Now maybe Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, maybe none of them are true. Maybe they just got theism right and nothing else. We'll see later why that's not so, why Christianity is true. But these are our choices from major world religions so far. So if one of these is true, how could God let us know it is? What could He do that only He could do to authenticate that one of these world religions is true? Miracles, right? That's point 3 of the big outline we're going through here. Are miracles possible? This is how God is going to help show us whether Judaism, Christianity, or Islam is true. Now, when we do this, we need to define what we mean by a miracle. So I'm going to spend a few minutes here, hopefully clarifying a few issues that many of us have when we talk about miracles, because I think a lot of times we use the word miracle too loosely as Christians, okay? We kind of cheapen the word. And so we need to be very precise, especially if we're talking to an unbeliever, okay? We've got to be very clear what we mean by miracle. So what I'm going to do, and this is all in the book. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. That might be hard to see up there, but I have it all on one page. But as you can see, there are at least 6 different categories of unusual events out there, and we need to distinguish them from a miracle. You've got an anomaly, you've got magic, you've got psychosomatic, you've got demonic, you've got providential, or I should say satanic, you've got providential, and you've got a true miracle. Let's distinguish between these so we can be very clear as to what we're talking about. Let's talk about an anomaly first. An anomaly is a freak of nature. The power is physical. The traits are it's a natural event with a pattern, and an example would be a bumblebee. You say, a bumblebee? What's that? Well, you guys all know what a bumblebee is, but why is that an anomaly? Because for years, scientists couldn't figure out how a bumblebee flew. Because physically, its body was too big for its very small wings. And it shouldn't have been able aerodynamically to fly. They couldn't figure it out, but all bumblebees flew, right? I mean, it's a natural event with a pattern. These bees are flying all over the place, but scientists are measuring their wings and weighing their bodies and going, how can it be? It's an anomaly. They couldn't figure it out. Until ultimately they figured out, I think this is what they figured out, that the bumblebee had some sort of power pack on it, which allowed it, like the Jetsons, I don't know, which allowed it to fly with the very short wings. So they ultimately figured it out. But for a long time, it was an anomaly. Naturally occurring event, and they couldn't figure it out. That's not a miracle, right? Nobody said bumblebees flying are miracles. All right, let's move on over now to magic. Magic is sleight of hand. It's human power. It's unnatural and man-controlled, like a rabbit in a hat. A rabbit comes out of a hat, and you go, how did that happen? Well, we all know that's kind of unnatural. Rabbits don't live in hats. Okay? And it's man-powered, and it's an illusion. Now, some illusionists are just incredible, and you just can't figure out how they've done it. But have you ever been let in on a magic trick? You ever been let in? After someone does it, they tell you how they did it, and you go, oh, man, that's brilliant, but I see how you did it now, right? It's an illusion. Didn't really happen the way you think it happened. It just looked like it did, okay? That's magic. Obviously, not a miracle, and there are some great magicians out there. Psychosomatic. That's mind over matter. The power is mental. It requires faith. It fails for some, and an example would be a psychosomatic cure. My co-author on this book, Norman Geisler, had a psychosomatic cure himself. he got an allergy. At least he thought he had allergies, and his doctor prescribed him a very powerful, some sort of anti-allergy medication. And he had allergies to plants and flowers and that kind of thing. And he's taken this allergy medication, and he was preaching at a church one day, and he was getting ready before the service up at the podium, and he's putting his stuff on the podium. He looks down, and there are flowers all around the podium. And his eyes started to water up, and he started to sneeze. And he said to one of the elders, he said, "Hey, could you move these flowers? I mean, I got allergies to these things." And one of the elders kind of looked at him and said, "They're plastic." So he said to himself, "Self, you just sneezed at plastic flowers. That allergy has got to be in your head." He threw away his medication. He's been fine ever since. Now, I'm not saying that all allergies are like this, right? Some people really do have allergies. That's not the point. The point is that some indeed are psychosomatic. There have been documented cases of women who actually think they're pregnant, and they begin to show signs of pregnancy, even their extended bellies. They think they are, but they're not. It's psychosomatic. That, again, is not a miracle, but it is an unusual event, right? All right, satanic is a false sign. The power is demonic. Its traits are its evil, falsehood, occult, and its limited power. An example would be demonic influence. A lot of people try and put Satan in the same category as God when it comes to power or demons. They do not have the same power as God. If they did, then we lose all confidence that the resurrection was done by God. Why? Could have been done by demons. Could have been done by Satan to mislead us, right? In fact, if you notice, during the plague, or during the Exodus, just before the Exodus, when Moses went to Pharaoh and began to do some miracles to try and convince Pharaoh that he truly was from God and you ought to let my people go, that the magicians of Pharaoh began to mimic some of these things, right? Until what? Until life was created. Then, what did they say? Oh, this is the hand of God, we can't do this. Satan cannot create life or resurrect life. You say, what about Revelation 13 or whatever it is? It does not say that Satan resurrects the beast. It simply says he reanimates him. Okay? So, Satan does not have the same supernatural power that God has. He may have supernormal powers, and God may allow him to do certain things, just as he does in the beginning of the book of Job. You know, in the book of Job, when God is the one that permits Satan to do certain things, but he still is under complete control, is God. God allows Satan to do certain things, but the power, the supernatural power, is God's and God's alone. Here's the supernatural, I should say, the unusual event that a lot of people confuse with a miracle. It's providential. Description: prearranged events with divine power, naturally explained in a spiritual context. Example, the fog at Normandy. What happened at the fog at Normandy? Well, at Normandy, when we had to invade the French coastline back in 1944, the weather was extremely bad. In fact, Eisenhower was thinking of calling off the whole mission because of the weather was so bad. At the very last minute, he got a okay from the weatherman. The weatherman said, I think there's going to be a 24-hour break. You ought to try it. Because, you see, if he couldn't go in on June 4th, they were going to have to wait like another 3 weeks because of the tide situation. So it was a very narrow window. And they had all those guys ready to go, and it would be very difficult on their morale not to go and wait 3 weeks. It would also be very difficult to conceal it from the Nazis as to where we were going to land. So Eisenhower said, go. And of course they went, as you know. And there was a fog that helped conceal some of our attack. Now, Was God behind that? Perhaps he was. Was it a miracle? No. It was a providential event. Fog happens all the time, right? Providential. It would have been a miracle if the guys had come off the landing craft there and the Nazis tried to shoot them and bullets bounced off their chests, right? That would have been a miracle. That wasn't a miracle to have fog there. It may have been God helping us out, but it wasn't a miracle. In fact, there's even a greater miracle in the United States history when it came to fog, and that was in Brooklyn in 1776. Washington was about to be overrun by the British in Brooklyn, and he was pinned up against the East River before there was a Brooklyn Bridge, as you know. And the entire British fleet practically was in New York Bay. They just couldn't get up because of the wind situation. They couldn't get up into the East River. If they had gotten up into the East River, they would have cut off Washington and he would never have been able to escape into Manhattan. In fact, the British had 200 ships in New York Bay in 1776. You know how many the Americans had? 0. Well, anyway, Washington's pinned up against the East River. For some reason, the British decide they're not going to attack. They're going to wait till the next day. That was a mistake. Because that night, Washington said, boys, we got to get out of here. And he commandeered a whole bunch of rowboats, and during the night, they transported thousands of troops across the East River into Manhattan while the British were asleep. They kept fires going, they kept horses out. A few guys would stay there in the camp and rustle around so the British would know that they were still there. The problem was the sun was coming up, and there were still several thousand men on the Brooklyn side of the East River. And when daylight came and the British saw that, they would have massacred them. But what happened? As the sun comes up, fog settles in over on the Brooklyn side. There's no fog at all on the Manhattan side. And the evacuation continues until all the men cross over, and suddenly the fog lifts and Washington's on the other side going. If the British had taken Washington out in 1776, this country wouldn't be here. In fact, there's a whole book on this called 1776 by David McCulloch. Now, is that a miracle? Natural event? Fog happens all the time. But in that context, only on one side of the river and not on the other? Providential, right? In fact, if you read the history of the Revolutionary War, how many times does Washington, I mean, they're almost about to shoot him at point-blank range, and somehow he doesn't get shot. What is that? Providential. Now, what is a miracle? A miracle is a divine act. The power is supernatural. It never fails. It's immediate. It lasts. It gives glory to God. An example is raising the dead. Okay? It never fails. When God wants to do a miracle, it never fails. It's not like, oops, couldn't do it. In fact, there's a time when it says Jesus could do no miracle in his hometown. What did that mean? What did that mean? Well, perhaps it meant that God didn't want to do a miracle in Jesus' hometown, so he never did one. Or maybe it meant that the miracles wouldn't have persuaded those people in the hometown, so he didn't do them. Miracles are always under God's control. God is the one doing the miracles. Now, he may do them through people, right? He may pick people to do miracles through, but they're under God's control. God is the ultimate authority here. It's his power, not ours, right? He's got the supernatural power. Now, he may use us, but it's his control that actually does the miracle. So that is a true miracle. So we need to be careful when we're talking about miracles. Now, people say, oh, it's a miracle, I met my wife. Well, maybe it is, and that's nice and romantic, but it's not. Okay? It may be divine. Maybe God may have been in it. I'm not saying God's not in it, but he didn't suspend a natural law. Unless he made your wife blind so she would marry you. I don't know. But He didn't suspend a natural law to do it. It's providential. All right, with that out of the way, let's talk about why miracles. Question, how many miracles are there in the Bible? A lot. Good answer. Easy answer. Not very precise. How many are in the Bible, approximately? This is the interactive portion of the program. Anyone want to guess? 1 million. That's a little bit high. Lower. 200. About 300, actually. You're about right. Now, some of those, I should say 300 instances. Some of the instances it says many miracles were done, but there's about 300 places it said miracles are done, right? Now, let's take the history of the Bible from, say, Abraham through Jesus and the apostles. How many years is that? Let's say about 1800, right? To make the math simple, let's take it from Moses, 1500. Because miracles really get kicked off very well with Moses, right? 1,500 years. So if you got 300 miracles or sets of miracles over 1,500 years, how many miracles is that a year? 1/5, okay. You have one miracle every 5 years, right? Now, do the miracles happen that way in the Bible? Is it like one miracle every 5 years? No, how does it happen? They happen in bunches. Why do they happen in bunches? God has a purpose, right? He's trying to authenticate someone or something. He's trying to get the message out there that you ought to listen to this guy, this apostle, this person, this deliverer. So the purpose for a miracle is to confirm the message. The miracle confirms the message. The sign confirms the sermon. Now, most, but not all biblical miracles occur in 3 areas. Moses, Elijah and Elijah, and Jesus and the apostles. Not all, but most. When I say most miracles, biblical miracles, I'm saying miracles that are done through people. God is doing miracles all through the Old Testament. But when he does them through people, he's doing them through these 3 sets primarily. Moses, Elijah, and Elijah, and Jesus and the apostles. Why? Why? The answer's right above it, because he's trying to confirm, right? He's trying to confirm these people. Moses, when he's standing before the burning bush, you want me to go back to Egypt? How is Pharaoh going to believe me? What does God say? There'll be some signs that I'll enable you to do, or I'll do through you, that will help Pharaoh realize that you're from me. Right? Same thing's true with Jesus and the apostles. Miracles confirmed the message. This is what it says, in fact, right in the beginning of the book of Hebrews. Who's got the book of Hebrews here? Open the book of Hebrews. This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles and gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. It's God's will, all right? These signs authenticated what Jesus had done, or authenticated that Jesus was an apostle, and also authenticated the apostles themselves. All right? Now, let's get to this question about miracles. Are they possible? You know, some people believe miracles are impossible. Like, for example, Noah. I mean, come on. You guys really believe in Noah? Doesn't that seem a little outlandish? That some guy would build a big boat and get all the animals 2 by 2 on there, and I mean, please. I think Noah happened. Number of reasons. First of all, there's a big flood story in virtually every ancient culture. How did that happen? I actually went to Iran last year on an expedition to look for the remains of Noah's Ark. Went with Bob Cornuke, who's kind of a Christian Indiana Jones. We went about 55 miles northwest of Tehran, found petrified wood at 13,000 feet. In fact, it's very interesting because we just had a conference call on this about a week ago, that the evidence that's coming out of those samples is very, very intriguing. We've got some specialists working on it. And I will say that petrified wood we have found at 13,000 feet. The nearest tree is at 8,000 feet. But we can't prove it's Noah's Ark because it didn't say USS Noah on the side. Okay, but there's a whole story behind why we think this could be the remains, and we'll get to that. Well, also, a lot of people have trouble with a resurrection. Everyone they know who's died is still dead. Why should you believe in a resurrection, right? Why? I mean, come on. For some reason, the biggest problem people have in the Bible is Jonah. I mean, what is that? Really? Can you believe in Jonah? There was a girl, young lady, standing outside of the Salvation Army, or standing outside Walmart, the Salvation Army tin there, and she had her Bible. You know, girl maybe 10 or 11, and a town skeptic came up to her and said, "You don't believe that Bible, do you?" And she said, "Well, I sure do." He said, "Come on, you can't believe the Bible. It's got all sorts of crazy myths in it." She said, "Like what?" He said, "Like Jonah. How can you believe in Jonah?" She said, "What's the problem with Jonah?" He said, "The gastronomical juices of the great fish would eat him up." She said, "Well, she didn't know anything about apologetics or giving evidence for what you believe." She said, "Well, it's in the Bible. I believe it." She goes, "How?" Or the skeptic said, "How could it have happened?" She said, "Well, I don't know how it happened, but I'll tell you what. Once I get to heaven, I'll ask Jonah how it happened." And he said, "Well, what if Jonah isn't in heaven?" And she said, "Well, then you ask him." Some of you will get that tomorrow. Actually, I don't know why people have trouble with Jonah. We keep people underwater for months, don't we? It's called a submarine, right? God can't do it for 3 days in a fish. Why not? Actually, what is the greatest miracle in the Bible? Is it Noah? Is it the resurrection? Is it Jonah? What is it? The greatest miracle in the Bible is the first verse. If the first verse of the Bible is true, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, then every other verse is believable, right? Because if the first verse is true, making the universe out of nothing, can he do whatever he wants inside the universe that's not logically impossible? Of course he can. What do I mean by logically impossible? Well, even God can't make a square circle, right? Can he make a rock so big he can't lift it? You heard this? Anyone who asks you that, say, how big does the rock have to be? Oh, they're going to say, well, big. You ask them, how big? I mean, really big. How big is really big? Infinitely big. Now, they've just crossed over logically into what we call a category mistake. You cannot have an infinitely big, finite thing. Right? Any rock God can make, he can move. He can't make an infinitely big rock because there's no such thing. The bottom line is, since the greatest miracle has already occurred, every other miracle is believable. If you can believe Genesis 1:1, you can believe every other miracle in the Bible, right? Now, I'm not saying every other miracle in the Bible at this point is true. I mean, I believe that, but we haven't reasoned to that point yet. I'm simply saying it's possible, right? Because if the first verse is true, every other verse is believable. Now, we have scientific evidence that the first verse is true. The cosmological argument and the teleological argument with it, that not only did the universe explode into being out of nothing, it did so with great precision. Remember the example we used here the other night? That if you altered gravity by 1 part in 10 to the 40, we wouldn't even be here. When the universe leapt into existence, it did so with such extreme precision. It wasn't like a chaotic explosion like we might think. It did so with great precision. What's 1 in 10 to the 40? If you were to take a tape measure across the entire universe, mark it off in inches. If gravity is set right here, and you move gravity in terms of its power 1 inch, the universe doesn't exist. That's how precisely designed this place is. Not this building, I mean, but the universe, all right? Now notice, Jesus actually referred to two of the most controversial miracles in the Old Testament to affirm who he was and what he was going to do. In fact, I'd just like to read one reference that Jesus had to Jonah. This is from Matthew chapter 12. If you got a Bible, go to Matthew chapter 12. And this relates to miracles, actually, because the Pharisees are asking him to do a miracle. And here's how Jesus answers. Matthew chapter 12, and we begin in verse 38. Then some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him, "Teacher, we want to see a miraculous sign from you." He answered, "A wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah, and now one greater than Jonah is here." What's the point? First of all, Jesus is comparing his own death, burial, and resurrection to Jonah. Do you think Jesus thought Jonah was literal? Or do you think he thought it was a fairy tale? He thought it was literal, right? Secondly, he's pointing out that the great miracle that generation was going to get would be the resurrection. And yet many of them wouldn't believe it. A wicked and adulterous generation asked for a sign. Watch it when you ask for a sign, right? Be careful. Jesus is saying the greatest sign I've already given you, right? Do you believe that? You notice one thing I noticed about miracles in the Old Testament? Did you guys ever notice that the Israelites, after they see miracle after miracle in the Exodus, it looks like they're going to get wiped out by Pharaoh. God shows up and protects them, parts the Red Sea, brings them manna from heaven, gets them water from a rock, does all sorts of great stuff. And Moses goes up on the mountain for a few nights, and suddenly they're worshiping the golden calf. How did this happen? Do you notice these people are awfully fickle? It almost seems like the more miraculous that God displayed himself to them, the more fickle they become. They came. It's like they wanted another miracle and another one just to keep them going. It had actually the opposite effect of what we might expect. Why is that? Are we like that? Yeah, I think we are. You know why? Because we see things happen in our lives, and we go, God was behind that, right? God was behind that. God did this. And then we wake up the next day and we go, man, I don't even know if there's a God. Why do we do that? We're just like they are, aren't we? Here's what C.S. Lewis said, "But if we admit God, must we admit miracles? Indeed, indeed. You have no security against it. That is the bargain. If God exists, miracles are possible, period." Now, if someone says to you, miracles don't occur, you know what you ought to say to them? Look around, you're living in one. The greatest miracle of all has already occurred, and it's the universe itself. In fact, when we get to Romans, ultimately, we're going to go through Romans here sometime in the next decade. In the very beginning of the book of Romans, in chapter 1, verse 18, Paul says, "For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth by their unrighteousness, for what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them, because his invisible qualities and divine power are clearly seen, so that men are without excuse." What was he talking about? He's talking about creation. Everybody knows there's a God. Oh, we suppress it. You don't need a miracle like a resurrection to know there's a God. Creation gives us enough evidence right there. But a resurrection gives us evidence that God continues to work in the creation he created, right? There were some, as you know, some founding fathers who were deists. They believed that God started the universe and then left it. A miracle like the resurrection or the miracles Jesus did or miracles that God might do today are miracles that show that God is still at work. All right, we need to cover this, and after this, we'll finish, but we need to cover this guy, David Hume. How many have heard of this guy? Only a few of us. I never heard of him either until I went to seminary. But this guy has had a greater impact on our culture than virtually any other philosopher of the past 300-400 years. More so than you think. This guy right here has more people thinking that miracles are not possible, or at least that you ought not believe in miracles, than anybody else. And here is Hume's argument against miracles, all right? Here's what he said, and there's 4 premises and a conclusion. We're going to look at each one of them. Natural law is by definition a description of a regular occurrence. This is all in the book as well, so if you don't get this, it's in there. It's a regular occurrence, right? It happens over and over again. Every time I drop this remote, it goes to the ground. I do it enough times, I start dropping other stuff, I realize there's some sort of natural force known as gravity. It happens over and over again. We agree with that premise, right? Next premise. A miracle, by definition, is a rare occurrence. Well, that's true, too. If miracles happened all the time, first of all, there'd probably be chaos, and secondly, we wouldn't be able to distinguish it maybe from a natural law, right? Miracles, by definition, have to be rare for them to have explanatory power that there's a God behind them. If they happened all the time, we might say they're part of the natural world. But when they happen rarely, we go, aha! This doesn't happen every day. Maybe there's somebody out there who's altering natural law or suspending natural law to get our attention. Third premise, the evidence for the regular is always greater than that for the rare. In fact, you see this when you watch a football game, right? You watch a football game, there's a close play, the ref sees it from one angle at full speed and has to make a call. You see it from multiple angles in slow motion, and you say, well, the evidence for the regular, we've seen it over and over again, is greater than that for the rare, right? Happens all the time. You realize you have a better perspective, you've seen it regular over and over again, ref only has it one shot. So that premise, that might be true as well. What about 4? A wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. That seems axiomatic, right? If you're wise, you always base your belief on the greater evidence, not the lesser evidence. Therefore, a wise man should never believe in miracles. If those 4 premises are true, you ought not believe in miracles. So which premise are you going to choose to attack? Tell you, there's a lot of people in American University thinking that miracles don't occur because of this argument right here. Which one's false? Anybody? Number 4, a wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. I can't see anything wrong with that. Number 3, why number 3? Cosmological argument. Now you're getting somewhere. Let's take a look. You are correct. Number 3 is the problem premise. The evidence for the regular events or for regular events is not always greater than those for the rare. Now, the way that you refute somebody's argument is you use examples from their worldview, not yours, right? So that's what we're going to do here, okay? In other words, we're going to try and give examples of things you might believe where he may believe a rare event rather than an event that happens regularly, okay? So let's give some examples. Examples from Hume's own worldview. First, the Big Bang Theory is not based on regular events. Cosmological argument, as someone said back there. It happened only once, right? And we don't have to have it happen over and over and over again for us to believe it, right? I mean, it's not the Big Bang, 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 bang theory, okay? Happened once, and we believe it. Now, at the time, there was no Big Bang theory in Hume's day. Hume died in 1776, but he would be a naturalist, and today he'd be someone who would say, you know, the Big Bang, we got good evidence for that. But it was a rare event, right? Happened once. Secondly, the origin of life on Earth does not occur regularly. If Hume were post-Darwin, he'd probably believe, if he was an atheist, that, hey, happened only once, where somehow the goo to you started, the goo to you via the zoo. That's the theory of macroevolution. Well, that goo, that non-living chemicals that ultimately came into life by not intelligent processes, by unintelligent processes, that dirt somehow came together to life, that only happened once, and the entire history of the evolutionary tree only happened once. In fact, we can't go in the laboratory and reproduce it. Happened once. It's rare, and they believe it. Macroevolution cannot be repeated. If it happened at all, it only happened once. That's what I just mentioned. The tree only happened once. And by the way, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, the entire history of the earth cannot be repeated. You ought not believe you were born. It's very rare. I mean, you can't be born again, can you? Well, actually, you can, but not in the same sense, right? So, premise number 3 is faulty, thankfully. Otherwise, we wouldn't be wise to believe in miracles. But notice that Hume's argument doesn't, even if it were true, doesn't disprove the possibility of miracles. What does he try and disprove? He tries to say that you ought not believe them. Now, there's a problem with any argument that says you ought not believe something that really happened, right? This is an argument from believability, not an argument from possibility. If this universe exploded into being out of nothing and there's a being beyond the world who brought that, and that's where the evidence points, then he can do whatever he wants inside the universe. It's not logically impossible. If he can make water, can he walk on it? Of course. If he can create life and then the life dies, can he resurrect it? Of course. By the way, this is one of the answers, no extra charge for this, but this is one of the answers to why did God decide to kill the Canaanites? Isn't that immoral? Or the Amalekites, or the Jebusites, or the termites, whoever's in the Old Testament, right? God who gives life can take life. In fact, God takes all of our lives. He doesn't guarantee us all 70. Does he? If he wants to take people out for his own purposes, he can do so. And he does so. Now, we don't always know why. We can know why maybe with regard to the Canaanites. In fact, he explains why. Because those people will pollute you and take you away from true worship in the true God, and ultimately, the Messiah then might not come through your bloodline. So he actually tells us why. The Canaanites, who had 400 years of warning, who wouldn't leave the land, God finally said, take them out militarily. God who gives life can take it. We don't have the authority to take innocent life. But God does because he owns it. Now, actually, why don't people believe in miracles other than Hume's reason? It's because they have a philosophical bias against it. You see this guy right here? This guy teaches at Harvard. His name is Richard Lewontin. He's an atheist, Marxist, Darwinist type. 10 years ago, in the New York Times, he actually had a moment of complete candor when he admitted why he and his materialist colleagues don't believe in miracles. Here's what he said. It's a little technical, but just read through it. You'll see the nub of it as we read it. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori, meaning our prior adherence to material causes, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Why does he not believe in miracles? Because he doesn't want God involved. So he rules them out before he even looks at the evidence. The whole debate in academia between the creationists or the intelligent design people and the evolutionists is not about science. It's about philosophy. See, you can't do science without philosophy. The creationist, the creationist intelligent design people say, look, there are two types of causes out there, natural causes and intelligent causes. and we'll consider both. We'll follow the evidence wherever it leads. If it looks like something was designed, we'll lead toward design. If it looks like something could have happened by a natural force, we'll lead toward the natural force. The evolutionists are saying, no, there's only one type of cause out there. That's an unintelligent natural cause. So guess what? When they look at the evidence, is there any other conclusion they're ever going to come to? No. Because philosophically, they rule out intelligent causes before they ever look at the evidence. See, your worldview can color your conclusion, right? If you're a theist and you believe miracles are possible because you see the evidence is good for theism, then you'll look at history and truth differently than if you're an atheist or a pantheist. You'll look through the lens of atheism and pantheism and say, I don't care what the evidence is showing me, it's got to be a natural cause. Worldview is so important, right? If you don't do truth and God to try and establish what your worldview is, when I say do truth and God, I mean go through the evidence to see if truth exists and you can know it, and if God exists and you can know it. If you get off track there, everything else you think from that point on is going to be wrong. You're going to be wrong about miracles. You're going to be wrong about the New Testament. So that's why we have to establish truth and God in the beginning. So does truth exist? Yes. Does God exist? Yes. Are miracles possible? Yes. The greatest miracle of all has already occurred. The only question now is to see if any other miracles have occurred since the beginning. And what we do then is we take a look at the New Testament to see if they are accurate, reliable records of what happened about 2,000 years ago. If they're accurate and reliable, and there was a man named Jesus who did these miraculous things and died and rose again for the sins of the world, then God has intervened again in the universe. If they're not reliable, then maybe Christianity isn't true. Maybe they just have theism right, Christians do, but they have nothing else right. That's what we're going to check out the next time we're here, which will be next Saturday. Does anybody have any questions on anything we've covered tonight?
My wife and I were in England about maybe 7 or 8 years ago now. I'm not sure how long ago, but and there was we were going to a town that was totally given to witchcraft. It's down in Land's End, and as we got closer and closer, the clouds got thicker and thicker and thicker. By the time we got there, it was almost like nighttime. It was so thick, and it was that way the whole day. And these people brought us there, and they said, well, we want to take you to this one little place that's so cool. So we went in, and there was a Christian bookstore right in the middle of this one lady that had a witchcraft store. She had gotten saved 6 months earlier. But she still had a lot of witchcraft stuff in the store. And so when I walked in, my wife and I walked in, she was reading a book by Rick Joyner. And we said, that's our pastor. And so we're walking around her store looking at books, and she'd have like a book on, she'd have Rick's book, she'd have this, and then she'd have like a New Age book, you know, and then she'd have like little demon things, you know. So Marla says, are you going to get rid of this stuff? And she goes, oh yeah, I just haven't had time to do that yet. And so anyway, we gathered it all up inside of a bag and walked outside, and there was this witchcraft store right across the parking lot, and the warlock was getting out of the van and everything. And anyway, we pray, break the power of the devil, and we crush those things, and like a pinhole in the clouds just opens up, and the light comes down on where we are and spreads out all over, you know, all the way out to this rock formation that looks like Queen Elizabeth's head. I know it sounds strange. That's real. And it closes up, like literally in about 30 seconds it closes up, and the sun never shone again that day. And my question is, was that a natural, or was that a miracle? Or was that, what do you call that?
Providential.
Providential.
If God was behind it, and it certainly seems like he very well could have been, it was providential because he didn't use any supernatural means to do it, right? But he could have done that. It reminds that what you just said there reminded me, I don't know if you guys were here in 1996, but they had just built Ericsson Stadium at the time, and one of the first events they had in there was a Billy Graham crusade. And it was a Saturday night, and the place was packed. There was over 100,000 people in there, or 90,000 people on a rainy night. And Franklin Graham got up to introduce his dad, and just as he said, and it's rained and everything, just as he said, "Daddy, come preach to us." Graham kind of got up and headed to the podium, and I kid you not, a beam of sunlight came down from the sky and pretty much lit up the whole stage. Everyone was like, whoa. Now, is that a miracle? No. But, seems kind of providential to me. Can I prove it? No. But there's so many things that happen like that, and you go, this is maybe beyond coincidence, you know? So, did you ever see that lady again and see if she got rid of her, or you crushed them all for her?
Not, well, we got rid of all the...
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
I don't know if it's, I wouldn't say it was a miracle. I'd say it certainly could have been providential. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
When you were talking about David Hume and you were disputing his third reason for
Yes.
why miracles are not possible. So one of the things you were talking about was evolution only happened once, the goo example.
Right, right.
But I know that there are people that would look and say it is a regular occurrence because we could look over time and see that, you know, in the animal kingdom there's been some sort of evolution, a change that would...
Yes, if evolution means change, we agree, but what can't be done there is the origin of life from non-living chemicals. We can't even do it in the laboratory with all our intelligence. And what we're saying is that somebody like Hume, who's an atheist, must believe that life came from non-living chemicals, right? There's no other solution. So if it came from non-living chemicals, and it only happened once, and yet he still believes it, despite the fact we cannot, in the laboratory with all our intelligence, create life. In fact, if scientists ever create life in the laboratory, it will prove creation. Why? Because it will show it took a lot of intelligence to do it. I mean, you know, scientists ought to put mirrors all over their laboratories to remind them that they're intelligent agents trying to do something that they say non-intelligence could do.